Hello, it's William Bell. Welcome back to allthingsfulfilled.com. If this is your first time visiting, we certainly appreciate you being here. We are going to talk about this is video number 2 in our series on the wedding feast of the Lamb, the marriage supper of the Lamb, where we are discussing the theme of not the resurrection, of the coming of the Lord, and showing the connection between the wedding feast and the destruction of the city, and particularly the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD of the first century. Now, if you haven't watched the first video, we encourage you to go back and watch it. It's, a rather short video on Matthew chapter 22, and this will help to build on the series of these studies. So we're going to get into Matthew 24 on this video, and we'll just basically talk about some things. Actually, the text that we want to look at is Matthew 25, because this is the one that mentions the wedding. So we're going to look in Matthew 25, and this is a very well-known parable that is used quite often, and everybody that I know of generally takes this parable to refer to the second coming of Christ, that it is, in most people's mind, it is yet future, but what we're going to see is how this parable is placed. Now, it is the opinion of many that Matthew chapters 24 and 25 can be divided into two separate chapters, two separate themes and time frames. One dealing with events that took place in 70 AD, and which would be Matthew 24, and sometimes they divide the chapter in verse 34, others in verse 35, and others in verse 36. There's no consensus of opinion in terms of where they should put the division of the chapter. The next point is that chapter 25 refers to something future that doesn't take place until centuries later. We're already now almost 2,000 years away, and it is supposedly yet future. So there is the view that holds that these are two separate time frames, and therefore one was talking about an event that took place in the first century. The second one is something that is yet to take place. However, that creates a bit of a problem, because if, as we discussed in Matthew chapter 22, the parable of the kingdom of heaven was like a man who made a wedding for his son. And of course, we saw in that parable where there was a city destroyed, and following that came the wedding. And so we have the destruction of Jerusalem that's indicated there. And most of commentators agree that it's a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem, but we also have the wedding feast that follows. And what we're suggesting in this series of studies is that the marriage always followed the destruction of the city. So we're going to look at that in this particular section. Now, of course, Matthew 24 is where they ask Jesus the question, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the completion of the age? And of course, he gave them signs that they would recognize. One of them, of course, was the gospel being preached to all the inhabitable earth among all the nations, and then the end would come, verse 14. There were the signs of the false Christ, the abomination of desolation that would stand in the holy place according to the prophecies of Daniel, and the time in which they would flee the city when they saw the Roman armies coming up, so that they would no longer be in harm's way. The chapter ends with or at least the chapter focuses on, in verses 30 through 34, the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds with power and great glory. And verse 34 says that this would be before that generation passed away. In other words, all those things would take place before that generation passed away. But what we see in this chapter is the fall of the city, and then following that, we have the parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew 25, which is also about the kingdom of heaven. He says, then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now, 5 of them were wise and 5 were foolish. Those who were foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them, but the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. But while the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. And at midnight a cry was heard, behold, the bridegroom is coming, go out to meet him. Then all those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are gone out. But the wise answered, saying, no, lest there should not be enough for us, but you go rather to those who sell, buy for yourselves. And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other virgins came, of course, knocking, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. And of course, it was a little bit too late for them to get into the wedding. Now, again, this wedding follows the destruction of a city in Matthew 24 and 25, just as in Matthew chapter 22, we had a wedding that followed the destruction of the city. Here we more accurately can define the city because they were talking about the buildings of the temple. It was most certainly the destruction of Jerusalem. Of course, chapter 23 leads into it from that point and forms the bridge between Matthew 22 and Matthew 24. Now, it is suggested that this chapter can be divided into two separate chapters. But if we do that, let's just say we did, and that Matthew 22 was discussing the destruction of Jerusalem, and Matthew 25 is discussing a future coming. Well, if the wedding followed the destruction of the city in Matthew 22, and that refers to 70 AD, it would mean that Christ has two brides, and therefore we would be suggesting that he's committing polygamy, which is not the case. We're suggesting that this is just one wedding, that they are both the same, that's spoken of in both chapters, just like the destruction of the city is the same. There were those who came and persecuted the saints up until the destruction of Jerusalem, for the most part. And when the city was destroyed, of course, that really put an end to many of the persecutions, at least to the Jewish persecutions for the most part. And so what we have is the destruction of the city, and then the parable, of the wedding feast. What are some of the reasons people have given to divide the chapter? Well, there are two basic ones. One, of course, is that they say that the word but is a conjunction, or that divides the chapter. In other words, it shows a contrast between the events of the destruction of Jerusalem, but also between the wedding. Well, the word but, or it's translated but in 1 Thessalonians, I'm trying to get ahead of myself now. In Matthew 24 is used several times following verse 36, but of that day and hour. It's used several times following that. If you read the chapter and read on through Matthew 25, you will find the word but is used several times, which would mean that every time it was used, there would be a different coming of Christ. So you'd end up with about 12 different comings of Christ just by looking at the word but. Of course, we have those who have come along and say, well, we have a very unique construction of the word but here. It is peri de instead of just de. And so with that, what they're suggesting is it's a stronger use of the term and therefore refers to the division or a division between these verses. Well, I would suggest that you look up 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and you will see the discussion of Matthew 24, verse 31, which is the gathering from the four winds under the sound of a trumpet, where the Lord has come in the clouds. Well, you have a cloud coming in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. In that cloud coming, you also have the sound of the trumpet, and you have the same time frame that says, we who are alive and remain, which is the equivalent of Jesus's words that all these things would take place before that generation passed. Now, at the conclusion of that chapter, of chapter 4, going into chapter 5, there is a conjunction used of peri de. As a matter of fact, I think John MacArthur suggested this. Well, or suggested that peri de was one of the dividing lines in Matthew 24. Well, what that's saying, if there is a dividing line between Matthew 24 and 25 because of the Greek construction of peri de, then there would also be a dividing line between 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and also 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Now, all scholars, all commentators, pretty much everyone acknowledges that 1 Thessalonians chapters 4 and 5 are one whole, speaking of the one coming of the Lord. And so what that would mean is, if peri de separates it, then now we have two future comings of the Lord, according to dispensationalists, and according to some amillennialists, it would be two separate comings of the Lord. And that would mean that we have a contradiction even between the teaching on the coming of the Lord. So not two, a going away and a return, but now you have even another coming of Christ. And so you would have the second coming of Christ, I guess, is the way they would look at that. On the other hand, If you took that in relation to the marriage in Matthew chapter 24, then what you have is the fact that Periode was not used to show a distinction between the time frame for a almost 2,000-year gap, but it was simply the same. All Paul was doing in both in First Thessalonians was the same thing Jesus was doing, was simply emphasizing the precise time and what would happen in the coming of the Lord, not severing that chapter from the destruction of Jerusalem. And it therefore shows that the destruction of Jerusalem is intended in both passages, because 1 Thessalonians 4 and Matthew 24, 31 and following are the same, because they're talking about the trumpet coming. And therefore, we have the wedding indicated and implicated in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And as we told you about this book before, by Don K. Preston, which is the We Shall Meet Him in the Air, the Wedding of the King of Kings, that we encourage you to get, because it really goes into an in-depth discussion on showing the wedding feast in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 compared to Matthew 24 and Matthew 25. So there is no distinction between the two. And the last objection that they would have, of course, on that is showing, stating that it's because of that day and hour. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but just to simply say that Jesus made a distinction between the general time, for the most part, and the specific day and hour in terms of knowing when that event would take place. He does tell them very emphatically that it would occur within the first century generation, that is, before that generation passed away. He did not, at that time, specifically give them a day and hour of when it was going to come. And let me give you an illustration. Now, I'm going to create another video, and I will upload it to YouTube, but I'm not going to tell you the day and hour I'm going to do it. I am going to get it done this week, but I'm not going to tell you the day and the hour that it's going to be done. So I know that's a little bit, you might say, over simplified in terms of what was happening, but that's exactly what's going on. You can know a specific time, or excuse me, a general time for something and not know the specific time. I think one of the better illustrations would be that in the days of Noah, when God told Noah that he was going to build an ark. And by the way, in Matthew 24, the Bible does say the coming of the Lord would be as it was in the days of Noah. So here's an appropriate illustration. Noah was told to build an ark and bring all of his family into the ark. Now, here's what he knew about that situation. He knew that the coming flood was going to be within his lifetime. However, God did not tell him the day and the hour as you read chapter 6. But in chapter 7, he tells Noah that he had been righteous before him in all that generation, and that it was time for him to go into the ark. And then God gave him more specific details. He says, after 7 more days, then you can bring your family into the ark. And so there was a marked distinction between the generation and the specific time that God revealed later. And I believe that that's the same case in Matthew 24. So the crux of the matter, however, is this, and that is, if we make the chapter or divide the chapter at any point, verse 34, verse 35, or verse 36, we run into the more serious issue of making 2 weddings of Christ, giving him 2 brides. We've already seen it in Matthew 22 at the destruction of the city. We have it here again in Matthew 24 at the destruction of Jerusalem. And therefore, these chapters are parallel. They refer to the one destruction of Jerusalem. There is no division that can be made between the chapter. And that just shows you that Matthew 25, that's indicated in the parable of the 10 virgins, is that which occurred following the destruction of Jerusalem, which would be 70 AD. And that proves that the second coming of Christ occurred in 70 AD. This is a theme that we suggest that you take a look at, and that will help you to understand eschatology in the New Testament. We're going to be talking about another wedding theme from another chapter in our 3rd video. And when we discuss that chapter, we're actually going to look at Ephesians and talk about one of the epistles so that you can see it there. And of course, there are several of these themes in the epistles of Paul, But we're going to look at Ephesians and note from that particular chapter and see if the same thread or the same theme runs through it as well. Now, as we close the video, what we'd like to ask you to do is subscribe to the channel. We appreciate that very much. Just click on the button that says subscribe and you're all done. The next thing we'd encourage you to do is to share the information with your friends. Just copy the video URL that you see in the top of the video. Just copy it right there in the address bar, and then share it through email. Send it to some of your friends and let them know. Post it on Facebook and LinkedIn and any other places that you have as your social media sites. We would appreciate that very much. Leave us a comment on the video in terms of what you thought. I know that we moved kind of fast through the video. We're trying to get these done, keep them short. You might have to rewind to listen to some of the things that we said, but leave us a comment in terms of what you thought. The next thing we want you to do, as we said, is visit our website. Particularly, you can go to Don K. Preston's website and purchase the book. We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. Once again, this is what the book looks like, and so you can identify it on the site. In addition to that, you can also find it at our site at www.allthingsfulfilled.com. Now, the last thing we want to point out is that we have a live radio broadcast at Blog Talk Radio /Fulfilled Radio. blogtalkradio.com /Fulfilled Radio. We're there live every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Time. That's Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Central Time. Make a note of it and jot it down and join us, because we are teaching an hour of studies on covenant eschatology. We also have a chat room that we open that allows you to ask us questions live. And so we'll take your question through the chat room, we'll get it on the air, and we will discuss your questions. So, get your questions prepared, and they can be about this video, about other things. We do have themes that we discuss. You can follow along with the lesson and ask a question pertaining to that. We look forward to seeing you. I'll be with you in the next video where we're going to talk about the wedding in Ephesians chapter 5. I'm William Bell with allthingsfulfilled.com. Thanks.